Greetings, Quester. The Meddlesome Meeples present Tome Talk with Richard and Matt.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Tome Talk, where Richard is going to be talking about the book Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari.
Yep, I've decided to talk a little bit about non-fiction.
This is a first for us, isn't it? Because so far we've talked about, in our previous Tome Talks, we've done science fiction, we've done historical fiction, horror, we've done fantasy. This is the very first grown-up, mature conversation we've had on this show.
Well, yeah, it was about time, really, wasn't it? I have been quite into reading non-fiction the last few years, and one book that I really did enjoy was Sapiens, also by Yuval Noah Harari, and a lot of people might be aware of this. This was quite famous when it was out, and basically it is a history book, and rather than being kind of a history of the world as such, it's more of a history of humans. So it's called a brief history of humankind. And basically it kind of goes through kind of what we are as
more
people.
of a anthropology.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But going right from basically from the agricultural revolution up until modern day. And yeah, it's really fascinating to get an insight into what we are from a scientific point of view, and I've heard from some people it can be quite emotional to read because they just realise that they just love being humans. It's quite nice, really. But yeah, you learn quite a lot about humankind in that book, particularly the fact that we are hunter-gatherers, basically. And although we live very differently now, a lot of the way that we still think is in a very hunter-gatherer way, because that's what our brains are meant to be or meant to do. So like we like to explore, we like to experience new things, and we have a tendency to binge as well. So I mean that's very hunter-gatherer, because if you find like a tree full of fruit, best thing is to eat as much as you can there. You don't know when you're going to find another one. So even though we don't have to do that anymore, we're still inclined to, but we can kind of use our higher brain functions to realise I'm not going to die if I don't eat this whole box.
So even
of
though
cakes,
we're no longer in the Bronze Age, and bronze is brilliant,
yeah,
we're still hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, basically. So that's what kind of Sapiens was, basically, and it ends with thinking a bit about the future, because basically knowing where we came from, it helps us to know a little bit about what we can expect in the future. Obviously, it's very difficult to know, but it kind of went into the ideas that with things like genetic engineering and modern medicine and everything, the future could look very different from the past. We could kind of be coming into another kind of revolution.
Well, when we consider the technological advances in the last 100 years alone, for example, it would be a very different world. If, say you took somebody from 200 years ago, brought them into modern society, they wouldn't recognise most of what we have in our lives.
Yeah, although we're very similar, physiological.
Psychologically?
No. Thinking about the physics of our body, really. Yeah, the psychologically as well, I suppose.
The that we still have, and
morphologically they do. Yeah, but the way we live is very different. That has a lot to do with not just technology, but also culture. It's like the technology becomes part of the culture, and changes the way we communicate and things like that.
Language has changed to adapt to that. The way we communicate nowadays. I mean, if you go back to, as I say, 50 years ago, the means that people would have to communicate with each other compared to nowadays, for example, the advent of modern mobile phones, texting, email,
things like that,
instant messaging, we have a very different life.
Yeah, we do. So basically we can kind of rely on it to carry on changing quite fast, since it already has been. And this is where
it's exponential growth, isn't it? Because as technology advances, that speeds up over time, because you haven't got to work so much on the basics. You can just build on what's already been established.
Yeah, it's collective intelligence rather than individual now. So and this is where, as I say, Homo Deus comes in. Now, I was kind of expecting it to start where Sapiens left off and kind of just keep talking about the future, but he basically goes back through human history again, but from a different point of view, basically just filling in a few gaps from this. So he didn't have to just go on what like basically what happened in history. It's basically what we learn about different ideologies. That's the main thing really in this book. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is, for me, I normally talk about sci-fi, like the future, and so when I'm picking a non-fiction book, I want it to be one about the future as well, just to start off with anyway. I might talk about other ones in other Tome talks, but so I just think that maybe if people enjoyed Sapiens but they thought, well, I like history but I'm not so interested in like speculations about the future, I think they'd probably be pleasantly surprised by what this is, because it is more of the same basically.
In Homo Deus.
Yeah, in Homo Deus, yeah. It kind of talks about, well, as I said, the different ideologies, and it's particularly talking about humanism, because that's basically what the main ideology is these days. Well, technically, I mean. And he will tend to talk about it as being a religion, which some people may not like, but the way that Harari tends to talk about religion is being an ideology that will get a lot of people working together all in one go, and like abstract thought that can join people together. So really in that way it's very similar to like a company, like corporations and things like that. There's a bit in Sapiens called The Legends of Persia, which I think is quite a good bit. It's talking about like what is a corporation actually. Like it's not the cars it's making, it's not the paperwork, it's not the building or the employees, but like everyone's got an idea of what it is. And he talks about humanism in a very similar way, and then there being kind of different versions of that, like liberalism and socialism, things like that. So, and then basically just speculating about how that could change with the advance in technology. Like what is going to replace humanism, if anything will, particularly once machines get in on the act of predicting human behaviour, things like that.
So is he talking about humanism from an ideological point of view? Is he looking at it as another form of, say democracy, that kind of belief system, or more on a religious basis? Or
well, humanism as in it being the thoughts and experiences of humans that are important, and then the type of humanism that won out basically over the 20th century was liberal democracy. So he talks about that as being a type of humanism, but it has kind of socialist elements put into it. I like the point that he read that obviously Karl Marx had a lot of very good ideas and a lot that turned out to not go so well in practice, but the thing is the West could read as well. They could read writings of Marx and they could incorporate the good ideas that he had. And
if you look at communism in its most basic form, the idea of people working together, sharing resources is, a positive thing. But if the last 50 years has taught us anything, it's that in practice communism doesn't work out so well.
That's it, yeah. But it's good to be able to realise that kind of thing, and then just keep things like having some kind of sense of equality of services in the country, and the industrialisation and like electrifying, just running electricity to every town and things like that. I mean, these are kind of ideas that kind of started there. But right, I just want to talk about some of the basic ideas, some of the things that make humans unique as opposed to animals is our ability to think collectively, and one of the ways that we've managed to do that is through writing, through being able to store knowledge and pass it on to other generations, make our ideas immortal basically in that way. And there's this little section that I liked about how much trust people will have in paperwork basically. And it sounds weird, but this thing I was just talking to you about before, this guy Aristedes de Sousa Mendes, who I hadn't heard of before, but once I read what he did I thought, well, he deserves a bit more credit really. So he was working in the Portuguese consulate in France, and this is during 1940, so obviously there's a lot of upheaval in France at the time. They were getting occupied, and as the tanks were kind of rolling in, it does. Obviously a lot of the Jewish people in France wanted to leave, wanted to like go to south, like Portugal and Spain, But to get the visa, you needed to get approval from the the Foreign Office. That's it. But obviously there wasn't really time for any of that. So this guy, Mendes, he decided to just disregard that rule and basically throw away his career by just printing the visas anyway. And he stayed up for like 10 days with him and his team, and just printed like 30,000 visas until they collapsed with exhaustion. And he was recalled to the Foreign Office and then fired for it. But the good point is that although they fired him for doing that, they did respect the visas that he printed, and these people did get saved. And that's just the
one man's job compared to thousands of lives.
That's it. You can appreciate what he did there, but it's just the fact that even though they didn't like what he did, they kind of respected the papers. The other thing that's in here is talking about in China. This is also in 1940 when... No, it isn't. No. This is during... no, it's not. It's during Mao. They actually really exaggerated how much rice they were producing, like on the paper, like all the way up. Like the farmers would exaggerate it, then the bureaucrats above
lying?
it. Yeah.
No.
Oh no, yeah. But like everybody just lying a little bit on each bit of paperwork, and then it made them really think that they had way more rice than they actually did. So they thought, I've got enough, we can sell it. So they just sold all this rice, and they thought they'd eat this non-existent rice that nobody had. And on paper it looked like it was all working, but it really wasn't. And really, you can't imagine any other creatures having that kind of a problem or things happening. But just another thing about humanism here, it's talking about humanist politics, the voter knows best. Humanist economics, the customer is always right. This is the kind of thing that he's talking about with this.
This is how he's explaining the concept of humanism.
Yeah, so, and basically, what the main point ends up being is that at the moment, it's like nobody can tell you that the way you feel about something is wrong. It's kind of what you feel yourself. You have the right to vote in whatever way you think. You have the right to buy the products that you think are best for you. But in the future, it could be, once we understand a little bit more about how the brain works, it is very possible that computers could start understanding us a little bit better than we understand ourselves. Because what we've found again and again is that what we think is happening in our brain isn't really what is actually happening. Like we have an experience
our perception of something. You said he explains it by talking about, no one can tell you that how you feel about something is wrong.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
I'm sure that we can all turn around to, for example, Nazis and say, "You guys are wrong. You have your views."
Yeah, we can do. Yeah. Well, this is just continue. Yeah.
It's not inherently correct, I think, to say that.
Well, no, it's oversimplified because I'm just trying to blow through a whole book in a few sentences. But we've got through this much to get to this point. Yeah. But basically, what is it? Just little choices that you make in your daily life. Like, say, you do certain things because you think it's going to make you happy, but then, say, an algorithm in Google has been watching you for your whole life, and they've worked out that thing doesn't actually make you happy. It makes you happy for a little tiny bit. No one's
checking my Google history, are they?
Definitely.
Oh.
No, it's just...
No trouble.
But then found out when you do something, when you do a different thing, you actually remain happier for longer, your blood pressure's better, all things like that. And talked about it particularly in a medical sense. Like one of the points made is that sometimes Google can tell that there's an epidemic happening, particularly like a flu, like the flu epidemic is starting, before the medical profession knows, because
people are Googling certain search terms on colds and things like that.
Yeah,
that
that's
makes
it.
Sense.
And you just kind of correlate that kind of data. And he also made the point that if we allowed Google to read our emails as well, I mean, I don't think he's really suggesting that as being a good thing, but like be able to read when you've maybe not Googled symptoms, but you've sent a message to work saying like, oh, I've got a headache, but I'll be there anyway. And it can just kind of make a big database of these symptoms and kind of tell what's happening before it actually happens.
All that says to me that is going to happen is an extension of what's already happening, which is like the Google search engines and other search engines. And our ISPs too can track what we're looking at online
that is it.
to market products back to us.
Yeah, particularly the main one is about sometimes algorithms can know that a woman's pregnant before she knows. Because there's certain things that people will buy, and there's been times
because people, once they are, for example, pregnant, there is an inbuilt desire within your body. Your body tells you, "I need this," so you go and get that.
Yeah, those kind of things.
Even though you don't necessarily know why, and that's where some of these cravings come during pregnancy, for example, because a woman knows, "I need this particular nutrient." Or a woman's body rather says, "I need this particular nutrient." So they'll have this desire for something that doesn't really, it's not really explained. That's why women eat. I'm talking as a man with 2 children. Women can eat really weird foods and things like that during pregnancy for that reason.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and that's why I really like this point, because you can see it already happening. That's why I was quite surprised that the book wasn't more kind of speculating about what kind of crazy things robots and things are going to do in the future. It's more like what is already happening and what is kind of inevitable from that, because algorithms are only really going to get better, and even if we don't do it here or in America, like in China, they'll get developed and things like that. So,
well, it's interesting that it's speculation based on existing patterns of behaviour.
That's it. Yeah, it's more near future stuff.
That's more believable than, if you can go out and find tons of books predicting the future.
Yeah, you can.
But it's more interesting than the fact that it's based on an anthropological study of existing human behaviour and conditions.
Yeah. And when the thing I was trying to say about our brains before is that basically it is a collection of algorithms, and the way our memory works is...
behaviour is basically learned through life, isn't it? From experiences and education.
But what we remember is weird. It's like this peak end method of remembering an experience. So while you're experiencing something, it could be absolutely terrible, but if it's not so bad towards the end, we're going to remember it as being not so bad, because it averages it out from the peak towards what it was like at the end.
Yeah, and that's something that we all do, don't we? Because it's like we tend to sometimes remember, the first place I lived when I moved out of home. There were a lot of negatives. If I sit down and really study it, I always remember it fondly.
Yeah,
that's a lot of bad things happen in that place.
I see. I
always remember it fondly.
Yeah, a computer would remind you of all the bad times. It would not forget or sugarcoat anything. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. There was also this other little anecdote mentioned in it about Sally Adee, who was a journalist she is, I assume, a journalist for New Scientist, and she kind of tried out this battlefield helmet that it's not like, because you think of electrodes going into your head, but this is kind of, the electrodes are on the outside, and then it kind of magnetically kind of suppresses certain parts of the brain. So she was on this sniper course where these targets kept coming up, like they were like targets that were like terrorists. So it was a bit scary, and she was kind of shooting them, and she said for every one she shot, 3 more would turn up, and she was kind of panicking, and she kept kind of jamming the rifle, things like that. And so she kind of felt really stressed by the end of that. But then they wired up this helmet, and she said she felt a bit of a tingle and a strange metallic taste in her mouth. But then when she tried it the next time, she was just picking off the targets really coolly. Basically, it just made her more able to concentrate just by shutting down certain parts of the brain that were the ones that might over-worry or overthink it or panic, things like that. And yes, as 20 of them ran at me brandishing their guns, I calmly line up my rifle, take a moment to breathe deeply, and pick off the closest one before tranquilly assessing my next target. In what seems like next to no time, I hear a voice call out, "Okay, that's it." So she just shot them all. And I thought this was really interesting, because I know our brains work in modules, but it's very interesting that once we find what those modules do, we already know quite a lot about that, but being able to, with something as non-invasive as a cap to wear, because he then goes on to talk about if you needed to study or something, wear a cap that would just make you not get distracted, something like that. I just think that kind of thing is very interesting. It would be interesting if you could
wear a cap that would just allow you to focus more. For example, you're taking an exam, you put something on like that will stop you, from being distracted, so you can focus on your exam. Or perhaps if you've been through something a traumatic experience, you could wear a cap that would help blot out that parts of your brain. And it would be interesting. I just know that based on human behaviour. It's not going to be long before someone makes, helmets that will make us better killers.
Yeah, well, basically that one was about that. Yeah.
I mean, humans have always been good at finding better and more brutal ways to slay other humans.
Yeah, that's it. But that's one of the things you can appreciate, and it is brought out here, is that with armies becoming more elite, they can also become smaller, and it's nice to know that when there is a war, they don't need thousands upon thousands of people for cannon fodder like they had to in centuries past. The section about war is pretty good in here, because it's talking about it's not much about the glory of the generals anymore. It's more, we're interested in the experience of the individual soldier, which are horrific. So that tends to be the way we view war these days. But anyway, those are the main points I wanted to talk about in this. Obviously, there are a lot more, but I just wanted to really emphasise how well grounded this is in reality, because it can just sound like it's going to be crazy when you talk about it. Are you
recommending this?
Definitely.
You're recommending Homo Deus, and would you recommend Sapiens first?
Yeah,
Or
I think.
Would you have to read them in order, or could you read each one individually?
I think you could read them individually, actually, but I think this is going to have broader appeal, and it has. So I would recommend reading Sapiens first, because Homo Deus, although it goes through human history again, it doesn't really tread on its toes.
Yeah.
And you can enjoy them both, and you do feel like you're learning more through the second one. Like we've said, it is very. It's done with a very broad view of human history. It goes into details and anecdotes, and then it will just blow through a few hundred years, like just to kind of keep things moving. And I think if people are really into history, in some ways they might find it a little bit frustrating because it's a bit oversimplified compared to what they're used to. But then when you're speaking,
but it's not really about the history itself, though. It's the analysis of the behaviour behind that history.
That's it. Yeah. You do feel like you have a much better understanding of the world we live in, the species that we are, and everything like that once you've read it. And I felt like that after Sapiens, and after Homo Deus I felt conflicted, because I'm kind of looking forward to things in the future, and also it can be a little bit worrying as well, because I mean some things I haven't spoken about, things like AI, which obviously it's going to be a real game changer. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting points in there. So I do recommend by Yuval Noah Harari both Sapiens and Homo Deus.
And I'm going to also point out, so that I can prove conclusively that I can pronounce that name correctly, Richard is thoroughly recommending these books by Yuval Noah Harari.
Nice. Well, great.
And not rehearsed at all.
That's why we had to make this long, so that Matt could practice.
You know what? While I was finding this Tome Talk quite particularly difficult, I've had an earworm in my head the whole time.
An earworm?
Yeah, you know the song Amadeus?
Oh, yeah.
Amadeus.
Farewell, Quester. To find out about other productions by the Meddlesome Meeples, then check out our channel or rendezvous with us at meddlesomemeeples.com. Until next time, Quester, farewell and keep thine axe sharp.